Alright, I'm going to speak about three English philosophers, and I'll also speak about a German philosopher named Immanuel Kant, but only for his responses to the three English philosophers. The first of these philosophers is Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon, the only significant contribution that he did make to anything was the scientific method. And this is obviously widely used today in analytical research and just in almost any physical science. That approach is used to determine the answer to a problem and to confirm one's own suspicions or hypothesis. But unfortunately, Francis Bacon made no other contribution to any fields at all. He tried to approach science as Aristotle did and contribute to everything. But the difference between Aristotle's science and Bacon's science was about 1,500 years. So Francis Bacon's world of sciences were much more developed. So the assertions he made in every field were proven wrong within probably about 100 years. And he actually died testing what could have proven merit in freezing a chicken to preserve its life, but he died with hypothermia while freezing the chicken. So he didn't get much out of it. We wouldn't find out more about the idea of freezing to preserve some quality of life for some time. Secondly, I'd like to talk about David Hume, who his most popular idea is what's called Hume's fork. And Hume's fork basically means that when you have truth, you can divide it into two categories. You have the priori and posteriori. And this means basically knowledge that can be present before experience, knowledge after experience. It's also called empirical. And this is really just like purely logic. So an example of priori would be 2 plus 2 equals 4. Okay, so you don't need to experience adding in your life the application of a priori knowledge to prove that that is true. That is inherently true based on the given values of these. If you change the values, it is no longer true. 2 plus 3 does not equal 4 because 3 has an inherent value that is its definition. If you change what that is in the equation no longer makes sense. Posteriori, however, is the empirical truth of something. For instance, the sun rose this morning. That is true because I experienced it. Now, Hume's fork basically is just distinguishing between these two, okay? And together, we have truth. Now, the big debate at the time was which is more integral to truth. Many people were trying to assert that one relied on the other. And Hume and many of his contemporaries were of the opinion that posteriori was more important. They said that a priori was simply an internal thing and that had no bearing outside the mind. For instance, it's actually really similar to 1984. The opposite actually. They asserted that because a priori is only personal and it's within your mind, there's no point trying to prove any of it. Like what is inside you that matters in the outside world. That was their assertion. Another thing I'd like to add, it's also called analytical, and this is synthetic. For instance, it's if you remember like chemistry in your 11th or 10th grade year, these are often used, well, not analytical as much as synthetic, but it's how you define an object. For instance, an apple has qualities that are synthetic and analytical. An analytical quality of the apple is its redness. Synthetic is the redness. Analytical could be like its chemical makeup. So that's another thing to remember, that objects, you can always break things down into these two, and they're going to be interacting, but usually one is not. In the case of objects, we usually define them by their analytical properties, but their synthetic properties are how we interpret them. So you have to keep in mind that not everything too is one or the other. We define some things synthetically and some things analytically. It just happens that most are analytical in how we define them. Now, the problem with Hume's argument is that he asserted one of these has dominance over another. And Kant's response to this is basically that these have to interact to exist. So without a priori, a posteriori has no bearing, and vice versa. This is because while this is inherently true, like in our minds, like we can prove this does not matter in the outside world. And to give a better example of this, I'll say in the maths, let's say, okay, you have an area of a house, and the area of your home, let's say A equals the square root of 36. So a lot of people would say, okay, well, the area of your home is probably like 6 square feet. It's a pretty bad house, but square root of 36 is plus minus 6. So we all know it cannot be minus 6 for the area, but that's an example of where our priori knowledge falls short, because this is an extraneous solution. A posteriori knowledge, cannot speak, comes in to either prove or deny certain things that we find through a priori. We use a priori to confirm things that we see posteriori. Posteriori proves things or assertions that we make in a priori. So without posteriori, we could in fact conclude that the area of a home is negative 6 square feet, as weird as that sounds. However, many, on the flip side I should say, not however, posteriori is really just observation. So it's like when people try to assert that the earth was flat. This was proven false primarily through priori. They did equations and they proved in fact that the world makes sense around. They did things with the way that planets were made. They used math to determine that. So while we had many observations that could in fact show that the world was flat, but the earth is the center of the universe, priori showed otherwise, and we found a different conclusion. But without one or the other, you make none of these, like you have negative 6 square feet in your house and the earth is the center of the universe. So while in both instances you can find facts that are, not facts, you can find things that are valid in a given scenario, they cannot necessarily be true. So that was basically Kant's response, more or less, to Hume's Ford and Hume's opinion that experience is more important than logic. Another problem that Hume brought up, or problem, this one's a problem, first one was no problem. Problem they brought up is what he called the is-ought problem. So it's what is versus what ought to be, because a lot of philosophers and just thinkers of the time would criticize what is and suggest what ought to be. So for instance, let's suggest politicians already are corrupt. Let's just make a general blanket statement like that, because then we would have a problem with that. But what is, and they ought to not be corrupt. Now, what Hume said is there is no bearing between what is and what ought. So like there's no logical link, and you cannot make that jump, because what is exists and what ought to exist doesn't exist. Now, you see where this is going. This is related to Hume's whole anti-logic nonsense, in that if it exists in real life, then that's all that exists. Like there's no reason to logically analyze things. However, if you want, you'd have to use logic to get from what is to what ought. That's the only way to arrive there, because with ought does not exist. So to arrive at what should exist, one must use logic, because it's the only way to arrive at something that doesn't exist. That's how we have to move forward in technology, actually. So you take what is to get to what ought, and when you use logic, I'd probably divide it into 3 categories. First, you have to find what is and define what is, basically logically. So, and now when I say define is logically, you cannot always define these things logically. So this is right in the sense that you cannot always go from what is to what ought, because what is cannot always be pragmatically approached. But if it is able to be pragmatically approached and you can divide it into logical pieces, then you need to find the piece that is defining is in this scenario. So what is carrying is to ought? What relationship do they have? You define that with A, okay? So you find what is that you want to change and you get to ought. You find the variable in this scenario, okay? Now at B, you define how the variable should change. You define the characteristics of the variable, what is desirable, what is undesirable. Think of it, B is going to be your derivative of A, okay? So you can also almost write it as A prime. That'd be cool. Using calculus. The point is, all A is a relationship. So for instance, if we have corrupt politicians and they ought to be not corrupt, A would be their moral values. And the thing that would be changing would, again, the thing that we would judge the moral values by, that we would change them over, is let's think of a code of morals by which we should judge them and over which we should change them. And then C would be, is there a rational or logical implementation of these two changes. So for instance, at B we found the problem, at A we found the problem, at B we found how the problem should change and according to what it should change, and at C we found if that is actually possible. So while it's purely logic that we arrived at this point, it is a point, and it takes you from is to ought. You cannot do that empirically. The only way to do that is logically, but the point is it does exist, so that Hume's assertion is just wrong. But it is useful in the fact that we cannot arrive from is to ought empirically, which if you want to give this kind of goes toward 1984, there's no reason to argue about what is, because what ought doesn't exist and what is does exist, so like why nothing else can exist, this is what is. But again, if you like 1984 and like that world, then you might like this, but when you don't like that world and you start using logic and you start to break that down, because it's really not that, it's not a valid assertion. Second person we need to talk about is George Berkeley. And George Berkeley, the problem that he addressed, I just responded to with basically the things that Kant came up with, which I used to respond to what Hume said. I responded this in a similar way to Berkeley. He had an idea, it's labeled the master argument, and basically it is, you cannot know, I'll read actually exactly what it says. Mind-independent objects do not exist because it is impossible to conceive them. So basically, the exercise is imagine a tree, which I'm sure everyone can imagine a tree, but now imagine a tree that does not exist in your mind. So which is like, it's impossible, it's a paradox. And the point of it is to show that our minds are limited and that we have limits to what we can conceive and like limits to our logic. And that comes up in just the algebraic problem I showed earlier, the square root of 36 equaling plus or minus 6. Okay. So just because something can exist through logic does not mean it is at all plausible, or it means like in like the real world. Okay. So while you can think of the idea of an unconceivable tree, you can't conceive the tree, but you can imagine that idea. But that's literally that's impossible. It's a logical just inconsistency. So he brought it up as an exercise, not an actual argument against anything, but he just wanted to portray that we are not able to conceive anything.